A man walks through a market in 2nd century Rome, carrying a leather satchel. He stops at stalls. He checks grain quality. He nods at merchants, listens to conversations, notes names. He is unremarkable, unhurried, completely forgettable. 3 of those conversations will end in arrests by the end of the month. He is not a soldier, not a magistrate, not an executioner. His official title is grain collector, frumentarius. He manages supply logistics for the Roman legions. He handles invoices. He is also the most feared man in the province. 10 organizations, different centuries, different continents, different languages, the same architecture. Each of them buried the most effective intelligence and assassination network of their era inside the most deliberately mundane cover imaginable. Tax collectors, postal inspectors, street vendors in festival crowds, mountain shepherds who knew every pass that no official map acknowledged. And when their masters decided they knew too much, or became powerful enough to threaten the people who had built them, those masters did something more thorough than destroying the organizations. They destroyed the record of how the organizations actually worked. Not the groups themselves, the method. The method was what had to disappear. These are the 10 cases where it didn't fully work. In the 2nd century, you could not travel anywhere in the Roman Empire without crossing their path. Every major road, every port, every garrison town. They checked grain quality at military depots, inspected supply lines, collected census data. Nobody paid them much attention. That was the point. The frumentarii began as exactly what their name suggested, logistics officers managing food supply for the legions. The word comes from frumentum, grain. By the reign of the Emperor Hadrian, who ruled from 117 to 138 AD, they had become something else entirely. Hadrian's biographer, Aelius Spartianus, writing in the Historia Augusta, records that the emperor used frumentarii to spy on his own friends, not enemies. Friends. He reportedly knew their secrets before they confided them to him. He intercepted their letters. He tracked their movements through men who appeared to be checking grain prices at the market stall outside. Their headquarters, the Castra Peregrina, the camp of foreigners, stood on the Caelian Hill in Rome. Ruins of it survive today. Not a barracks in any conventional sense, an intelligence hub disguised as a transit facility for out-of-town soldiers. What made the frumentarii structurally terrifying was their legal cover. Under Roman law, a frumentarius could enter any private home, inspect any warehouse, demand any documentation, all under the pretext of grain inspection. They used this access to collect blackmail material on provincial elites, monitor religious minorities, and arrange disappearances that never appeared in official records. They also traveled dressed as merchants and roadside wanderers. No uniforms. No insignia. Any person selling figs at a roadside stall in Antioch or Alexandria could be reporting your conversations back to the Castra Peregrina by the end of the week. When Emperor Diocletian officially dissolved them around 300 AD, he cited their dura nomen, their terrible reputation. The population, he noted, feared them more than enemy armies. He disbanded them publicly, with ceremony, with the clear implication that this particular instrument of state terror had been retired permanently. He then immediately created the agentes in rebus, the agents in affairs, who received even broader legal powers, were removed from military command entirely, and reported directly to a single civilian official. The transition took less than 18 months. The staff was largely the same people. No systematic record of frumentarii operations was preserved in any public archive. The cases they handled, the people they disappeared, the files they built on provincial governors, all of it cleared during the Diocletianic reforms. What remains are 36 burial inscriptions, a handful of references in legal codes, and one historian's offhand note that Hadrian knew everything about his inner circle before they knew it themselves. The files they kept on people who are now historical figures, the reports on senators and priests and generals whose names appear in every Latin history course, those files are gone. Deliberately, systematically, gone. Which means someone decided that their specific contents were more dangerous than the absence of records. The grain men were not disbanded. They were reclassified. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V is one of the most powerful men alive in 1547. He commands armies, controls trade routes, holds authority over kings. When he needs to communicate about a regional judicial matter in Westphalia, He does not send a formal dispatch. He writes a coded letter, using a cipher he normally reserves for foreign military intelligence. He is writing about a court that officially handles property disputes. The Vehmgericht, the Vehm, operated from the German region of Westphalia from the 13th century onward. On paper, it was a network of regional folk courts, remnants of earlier Germanic tradition for times when imperial authority couldn't reach every village. In practice, it was something more constructed, a secret fraternity of sworn judges who held absolute power over life and death across the entire territory of the Holy Roman Empire, answerable to no king, no bishop, and no pope. Initiation required a blood oath. The oath's content, never to be revealed to wives, children, or fathers, included one specific commitment. If the Vehm issued a death sentence against your own father, you were required to carry it out yourself, or be executed in his place. Their sentences were delivered in the early morning, before the household woke, a dagger pressed into the doorpost at chest height, sometimes with 4 letters carved into the blade: S, S, G, G, Stein, Strick, Gras, Grun. Stone, rope, grass, green. Not a threat, a list of materials. The condemned person was expected to understand that these were the instruments already selected, and that the only remaining question was when. No trial date, no appeal, no name on the dagger. Consider what that morning felt like. You step outside before the house is woken. You reach for the door frame in the dark, and your fingers find something cold pressed into the wood at chest height that wasn't there when you went to sleep. You don't need to hold it up to see the letters. You already know, because every person who had ever been in proximity to the Vehm's outer circle had been told what they meant, and the people who hadn't been told had heard the stories, which amounted to the same thing. The dagger was not a threat. It was a notification that the relevant decision had already been made. Any of the estimated 100,000 initiated members, scattered across the empire as merchants, farmers, and minor officials, had a legal obligation to carry it out on site. Historians working from the Dortmund archives, which contain more Vehm trial records than anywhere else in Europe, have documented that the organization's primary function in the 15th century had shifted almost entirely to economic regulation, land inheritance disputes, control of Westphalian salt and textile trade routes, the private adjudication of debts between noble families who could not challenge each other openly without risking war. The Vehm was enforcing property law for the elite, with death sentences, in secret. What the official historical account does not adequately explain is why emperors used it rather than simply reforming it. Frederick III, Charles V, and Maximilian I all communicated with Vehm leadership, all in code, all in language suggesting the organization held leverage they could not acknowledge without cost. The Vehm was officially abolished in 1811 under Napoleonic administration. Its records were not destroyed. They were sealed and reclassified as ecclesiastical archives. Some of those seals were not opened until the 1980s. Researchers found trial records naming half the aristocracy of Central Europe as either defendants or judges. What was published from those records was a procedural note confirming that the cataloging had been completed. The trials, their participants, their verdicts, what was said and what was decided, were returned to sealed storage. There are roughly 300 years of aristocratic criminal proceedings sitting in an archive in Westphalia. The inventory list of what they contain is available. The contents are not. And perhaps the more unsettling thing is this: the organization that supposedly needed to be abolished had been rendering judgments for 6 centuries. Nobody has yet explained what replaced it. In 1090 AD, a man named Hassan ibn Sabah, a former student of mathematics and astronomy from Ray, in what is now northern Iran, acquired a mountain fortress by a method no surviving source fully explains. The fortress was called Alamut. The valley below it was already inhabited. The garrison was already in place. Within months of his arrival, it was his. He never left it again. For 35 years, from a single room at the top of that mountain, communicating exclusively through encrypted couriers and written correspondence, Hassan built the most operationally efficient assassination network the medieval world had documented. The Nizari Ismaili movement, his order, was a minority Shia sect surrounded on all sides by Sunni states committed to its extinction. They had no conventional army. What they had instead was Hassan. The Persian chronicles of Rashid al-Din Hamadani, along with Crusader accounts compiled in the 13th century, confirm the operational record. In 193 years of operation, the organization successfully assassinated the Seljuk vizier Nizam al-Mulk, Conrad of Montferrat, who was king-elect of Jerusalem, and dozens of senior officials across 3 continents. In almost every case, the attacker was a member of the target's own household staff, having spent years building trust before acting. But here is what gets left out of every summary. Alamut was not primarily a fortress. It was a library. Contemporary sources, including the account of Marco Polo, who passed through the region in 1273, describe a collection that rivaled anything in the Abbasid Caliphate: astronomy, mathematics, pharmacology, agricultural engineering. The mountain's concealed water system, which collected rainfall and routed it through cisterns carved directly into the rock, allowed the fortress to sustain siege for years. The engineering predated regional capability by generations. And this is the detail the assassination narrative consistently obscures: the hydraulics. A man who can design a rainfall collection network inside a high-altitude mountain fortress understands something fundamentally different from how to eliminate a vizier. He understands how systems break, how they can be maintained indefinitely, while their exterior presents something much smaller and simpler than what's actually running. That kind of knowledge, not tactical but systemic, is exactly what a conqueror would need to destroy before anyone else could examine it. Not next week, that night. When Hulagu Khan, the Mongol commander, finally destroyed Alamut in 1256, he did something almost uncharacteristic for a Mongol conqueror. He ordered his scholars to save a portion of the library before burning the rest. Whatever was in those books was worth keeping. The operational records, the network maps, the pharmaceutical formulae, ash within 48 hours. The story that survived, hashish-addicted killers seduced into murder by a fake garden paradise, has no credible historical basis. The word hashashin, from which the English word assassin derives, most likely originated with enemies who needed an explanation. How does a force of several thousand believers in an isolated mountain range hold the entire Islamic political world hostage for nearly 2 centuries? Through strategic, targeted death. The Mongols kept the astronomy. They burned the rest. And what the rest contained, we have no way of knowing, because the people who knew were careful enough to make sure we wouldn't. Here is what we know. The year is 66 AD. Jerusalem is 3 days into open revolt against Rome. A disciplined military operation has just been completed against the Antonia fortress, the Roman garrison headquarters. Standard insurgency logic dictates that captured weapons would be the first priority, food stores second, communication lines third. The first building that burns is the archive. Not a weapons depot, not a granary. The archive, the building where Jerusalem's debt records, tax records, land deeds, and creditor registries are stored. Every document defining who owes what to whom in the most economically strangled province of the Roman Empire. One building, one fire, and the entire legal basis for Roman taxation of Judea is gone before dawn. This was not vandalism. This was a financial operation. The Sicarii, whose name derives from the Latin sica, a short curved dagger worn concealed under a cloak, are described by the Jewish historian Josephus in his work Bellum Judaicum as religious extremists and political assassins. The first description is accurate. The second is incomplete in ways that stop being accidental once you trace their actual sequence of operations. Their defining tactic was developed for use in the crowded festival markets of Jerusalem. Approach the target in a dense public crowd, strike once with the concealed blade, then begin screaming in apparent horror alongside the crowd. The killer became invisible the moment the body dropped. The Roman guard had no means to identify an attacker who had instantaneously become a witness. Their documented victims included the high priest Jonathan, hired work, according to Josephus, indirectly commissioned through the Roman procurator Felix. Which is to say, the Roman administration paid to have its own high priest killed using people it officially classified as bandits. Felix later arrested Sicarii leadership, then freed them in exchange for hostage deals. The organization had a functional negotiation structure with the very empire they were fighting. The archive burning needs to be understood in this context. Josephus records explicitly that it was done to win the poor population by destroying proof of their debts. This is accurate. It is also a description of the single most effective economic weapon available to an insurgency in a debt and slave economy. Eliminate the legal infrastructure that makes taxation possible, and the empire's ability to extract revenue from a province begins collapsing within months. They burned the records. Rome burned the city, and in writing the official history, Rome reclassified the people who had just executed a sophisticated campaign of financial warfare as latrones, common bandits, stripping them of any strategic or political significance. The term latrones entered Roman legal vocabulary and stayed there for centuries. What did not stay, what was never formally acknowledged, and therefore never formally contested, was the question of what had been in that archive. Whose names appeared in the debt registers? Which Roman officials held liens on which Judean land? What the full financial relationship between the empire and the province actually looked like before the fire reduced it to ash? Rome chose not to ask, which, given how carefully Rome documented everything else, is itself a kind of answer. Somewhere in central India, around the year 1780, a group of travelers joins your caravan. They are friendly, they share food. 3 days later, they are still with you. You have begun to trust them. 2 million people, across 6 centuries, made this mistake. The Thuggee operated across central and northern India from at least the 13th century until British authorities dismantled the network in the 1840s. Colonial Administrator William Sleeman, who led the suppression campaign, estimated the total death toll somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million. Every serious modern historian considers that number impossible to verify. Every serious modern historian also notes that the systematic nature of the operation was not in question. They were not a cult. The religious framing, devotion to the goddess Kali, the ritual character of the killing, was real, but it functioned as internal cohesion, not as primary motive. The motive was logistics. Thuggee members lived as ordinary craftsmen, farmers, and minor merchants for 11 months of each year. During the 12th month, groups ranging from 10 to 40 men assembled along specific trade routes. They infiltrated traveler groups over several days, using established rapport-building protocols, then executed their targets using the rumal, a weighted silk cord, in a coordinated action that left no wounds and required no weapons detectable on a search. They communicated through a constructed internal language called ramasi. This allowed operational discussions in the full presence of their targets without detection. Constructed argots require years of coordinated development and maintenance. The existence of ramasi alone indicates organizational sophistication well beyond any description of casual banditry. Parliament passed the Act of 1836, creating a new legal category. Membership in the Thuggee network was a capital offense entirely independent of any proven individual killing. No specific crime needed to be demonstrated. Belonging to the structure was sufficient. They also established industrial schools in Jabalpur, specifically designed for the children of arrested members, designed to break the hereditary transmission of operational knowledge. They didn't just arrest them, they arrested the knowledge. William Sleeman's published account, Ramasiana, was the first systematic documentation of the Ramasi language. His successor reports noted something uncomfortable. The regional Indian rulers, who had been nominally cooperating with the suppression effort, had also been receiving a portion of stolen goods for generations. The network had been a de facto parallel taxation system for local elites, one the British colonial administration found inconvenient to fully document alongside the official narrative of a religious death cult. The word thug entered English as a synonym for common criminal. The network it described, a 6th century, continent-spanning logistics operation with its own language, purchased immunity from regional rulers, and a death toll that demonstrably reshaped population patterns along subcontinent trade routes, became a footnote. The same move had worked in Judea 17 centuries earlier. Replace the political and financial machinery with a story about religion. Make the name toxic enough that no one examines the structure underneath it. But Sleeman's Ramasiana survived. Published in 1836, it documented the Ramasi vocabulary in enough detail that you can still read those words today. The language that allowed Thuggee operatives to discuss killing their traveling companions in full earshot of those companions, present tense, in the middle of an ordinary conversation, sits in a book in several university libraries. The 6 centuries of organizational infrastructure that developed and maintained that language, the network of regional rulers who sheltered it, the parallel revenue system it funded. Those details are not in any curriculum that gets assigned in school. What Schliemann documented is preserved. What it actually took to build it is not. In 1582, a man named Hattori Hanzo, a mid-ranking samurai from the mountain province of Iga, made a decision that would define the next 250 years of Japanese political history. He had been born into a network that was, at that moment, technically no longer supposed to exist. Oda Nobunaga had sent 40,000 soldiers into Iga the previous year, specifically to destroy it. 40,000 soldiers against a province of farmers, craftsmen, and people official histories described as hired spies. Nobunaga's generals expected to walk through in a week. They spent 3 months fighting an enemy that dissolved into forest, collapsed tunnels behind itself, and communicated between positions using a code no outsider had ever broken. When the campaign was over, the province was physically destroyed. The people were scattered. The network was not. Hattori Hanzo guided Tokugawa Ieyasu, who would become the first shogun of a unified Japan, safely through the Iga mountain passes when Ieyasu's life was in immediate danger following Nobunaga's assassination. The Iga shinobi who controlled those passes did not act out of loyalty to Ieyasu. They acted because Iga had been playing a longer game for 300 years. The Iga Confederation was not a criminal organization. Between 1400 and 1581, it operated as a self-governing alliance of samurai, warrior farmers who owned their land and answered to no single lord. It had a constitutional document formalizing collective governance. This document predates any comparable democratic instrument in East Asia by over 2 centuries. What funded this independence was a monopoly on specific technical knowledge that the surrounding feudal domains could not replicate and were too afraid to ignore. The Bansen Shukai, a comprehensive intelligence and tactical manual compiled in 1676, now preserved in Japan's National Diet Library, describes not only methods of infiltration and combat, but deep working knowledge of meteorology, psychology, chemistry, and incendiary technology. These were not imported techniques. They were developed internally over generations and deliberately withheld from every surrounding domain. A daimyo who needed a castle gate open from the inside, or a rival's granary burned without attribution, or a courier intercepted without trace, had one option. He paid Iga's price, and he accepted Iga's terms. The price was always less than the alternative. That was the leverage, not armies. Knowledge of what the daimyo needed, and the certainty that nobody else could provide it. The standard long-term operation was called kusunoki, grass. An agent was placed in a target location, sometimes years before any anticipated conflict, living as an ordinary servant or farmer, not gathering intelligence, simply existing, building trust, waiting for the moment when opening a gate was worth more than 100 soldiers outside it. After Hattori Hanzo's service to Ieyasu, the Iga network was formally absorbed into the Tokugawa intelligence structure. Hanzo became head of the personal bodyguard unit. His name was given to the gate protecting the inner palace of Edo, the Hanzomon, which Iga-descended guards would control for 250 years. The Tokugawa administration then did something methodical. They preserved the techniques while eliminating the independence. The network became a bureaucracy. The constitutional document was reclassified as an administrative record of a defunct regional council, technically still there, functionally invisible. The gate that Hattori Hanzo's descendants guarded for 250 years still stands in Tokyo. It is called the Hanzomon. You can walk through it. There are no plaques explaining what his family actually was, or what the organization they came from actually did, or what document they wrote in 1560 that no recognized state in East Asia would match for another 300 years. The gate is there. The history it represents was filed somewhere else. In 1946, 48 separate attacks occurred against British colonial government buildings and police stations in Nigeria, all within a single year, all involving the same method. Entry at night, no firearms, wounds consistent with large animal claws, no witnesses. The British administration's official report classified them as attacks by a leopard cult. The Leopard Society, known as Anyoto in the Congo, and under various names across Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Nigeria, operated across national borders in West and Central Africa from at least the 19th century through the 1950s. Colonial administrations across 4 countries spent decades attempting to suppress an organization they could not map, because they consistently misidentified what it was. The attacks were not random. They targeted, with documented precision, 3 specific categories of people: Africans working as tax collectors for colonial administrations, Africans serving as police informants, and European employees of extraction companies who had violated traditional resource boundaries recognized by the organization's internal law. The weapons were deliberate in their deception. Steel claws, custom fabricated to produce lacerations consistent with a large cat, were worn over the hand. Wooden foot pieces, shaped to produce leopard print tracks, were strapped to the attacker's feet. From the physical evidence alone, a colonial investigator without significant regional expertise would, and frequently did, conclude that an animal was responsible. This was the operational signature of an organization that understood how its adversaries processed information. The society maintained a hierarchical structure, led by spiritual leaders called Zo, who held regional authority and coordinated operations across the 4 affected territories. The existence of cross-border coordination is confirmed by British intelligence reports from 1946, which noted that attack patterns in Nigeria and Sierra Leone reflected an identical operational template, despite occurring 4 months apart and 400 miles apart. In 1948, colonial authorities publicly hanged 39 convicted members in Sierra Leone. The stated purpose, recorded in administrative correspondence now held in the Public Record Office in London, was not primarily deterrence. It was to demonstrate to the local population that the men were mortal, because the local population had not been entirely certain of this. There is a detail in the 1948 British administrative file that nobody discusses. The claws confiscated were not crude. They were precision-fitted, custom-made for specific hands. Someone was manufacturing them, and manufacture implies supply chain, implies payment, implies someone who was never putting their own hands into them. The available file identifies the arrested members. It does not identify the manufacturer. The file ends exactly where the more interesting question begins. What the colonial administration's records do show is an organization that conducted synchronized cross-border operations against hardened government targets across Sierra Leone, Nigeria, Liberia, and the Congo. It used fabricated forensic evidence to defeat attribution. Its leadership structure survived repeated mass arrests across 4 separate colonial jurisdictions. Whether that amounts to a coordinated intelligence service or something harder to classify, the records don't say. They stopped asking after 1948. The hanged men had served their purpose. The simpler story was already in the newspapers. In 325 AD, the Emperor Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea to settle what Christians believed about the nature of Christ. Hundreds of bishops came from across the empire to argue theology. The winning position became orthodoxy. The losing position became heresy. The enforcement of that outcome, the actual mechanism, was not the church. They were officially prohibited from carrying weapons. They had no authority to make arrests in most provinces. Their legal title translated, roughly, as people who deal with matters. Their enemies called them curiosi, the curious ones, because of their habit of opening correspondence that did not belong to them. In the 4th century Roman and subsequently Byzantine Empire, they were the most feared people alive. Diocletian disbanded the frumentarii and created the agentes in Rebus in approximately 300 AD. If you are wondering whether this represents genuine reform, the agentes received broader legal authority than the frumentarii, a higher maximum staffing level of up to 1,200 elite agents, and were removed from military command entirely. They reported instead to a single civilian official called the Magister Officiorum, the Master of Offices. Notice how the frumentarii had been a military unit answerable to the emperor through a general. The agentes were a civilian unit answerable to one man. The chain got shorter, not longer. They inspected the cursus publicus, the imperial postal system, which gave them legal access to every way station, every horse depot, and every document in transit across the empire. The inspection rotation occurred every 2 years. Each rotation refreshed the agent's network of informants, from Alexandria to Constantinople to the Rhine frontier. No governor could receive a private communication. No bishop could convene a council. No general could write to his family without the theoretical possibility that a man indistinguishable from a mid-level postal clerk had already read it. The Codex Theodosianus, the compiled legal code of the empire, contains an entire legislative section specifically regulating what the agentes were and were not permitted to do. You only write those laws when the behavior they prohibit has been occurring. During the theological controversies of the 4th and 5th centuries, the Arian question, the Monophysite split, the Council of Chalcedon, the agentes served as the enforcement arm of imperial religious policy. A bishop who reached a theological conclusion the emperor found inconvenient was not usually executed. He was informed by a polite man carrying a travel authorization that his new assignment was in a diocese 1,200 miles from Constantinople, effective immediately, and that his correspondence from the previous 6 months had already been reviewed. The polite man was an agent. Here's the connection nobody makes explicit. When frumentarii records were formally sealed in 301 AD, they were transferred into the new agentes archive. This transfer is documented in the Notitia Dignitatum, the official administrative register of the late empire. Someone in 301 AD made the specific decision to move the operational files rather than destroy them, and documented that decision precisely enough that scholars in the 21st century can confirm it happened. The content of those files, the names, the cases, what was found, has never been published. The agentes outlasted the Western Roman Empire's fall in 476 AD. They operated under Ostrogothic administration. They continued under Justinian's reconquest. Their last documented reference in active function is in the early 7th century. And then something interesting happens in the archive. The title disappears, but the function of intercepting correspondence and monitoring clergy does not. It simply stops being attributed to any identifiable body. There is a gap in the Byzantine administrative record between approximately 630 and 700 AD, where nobody responsible for reading other people's mail appears on any organizational chart. The mail was still being read. The organization chart simply stopped recording who was doing it. On the morning of March 7, 1951, Iranian Prime Minister Haj Ali Razmara walked into the Shah Mosque in Tehran for Friday prayers. He had been receiving death threats for 3 months. The threats had been logged by the Iranian secret police and forwarded to the relevant ministries. He was shot in the mosque by a professional. The shooter was Khalil Tahmassebi, a member of the Fada'iyan-i Islam, the Society of the Devotees of Islam, a closed network of political operatives founded in Tehran in 1945 by Nawab Safavi, a theology student from a working-class Tehran family. The official account describes the Fada'iyan as a radical Islamist group committed to implementing Sharia law and purging Western influence from Iran. The Central Intelligence Agency documents describe something more specific. The relevant files, now accessible through the mandatory declassification review process, describe a network with operational relationships to elements of the Iranian secret police and with figures connected to foreign intelligence interests. The documents do not use the word asset. What they describe is a pattern of contact, financing, and operational protection that the available evidence does not fully explain, and that no subsequent investigation was convened to clarify. Between 1945 and 1955, the Fada'iyan assassinated or attempted to assassinate 5 senior Iranian officials. Whether this sequence was directed, tolerated, or merely convenient depends on which archive you trust, and which parts of that archive you can access. What the timeline does show, Razmara was shot in March 1951. Mossadegh came to power in April. Iranian oil was nationalized in May. Operation Ajax, the joint intelligence operation to remove Mossadegh, was executed in August 1953. The Fada'iyan's leadership had been publicly imprisoned after Razmara's assassination. Their leader, Nawab Safavi, was documented traveling freely under secret police protection during his sentence. He was executed by firing squad in January 1956. Tahmassebi, the shooter, was released as a national hero, rearrested, and vanished from the available record after 1955. No investigation was ever opened into the financial relationships the declassified documents describe. The documents themselves were not publicized when they became available. They are accessible in the National Archives. They have been cited in 3 academic papers. The documents describe a network. They describe contacts. They describe protective arrangements that should not have existed. What they do not contain, and what no subsequent inquiry has attempted to reconstruct, is any account of who made those arrangements, or on whose authority, or what was discussed at the meetings the documents confirm took place, but do not transcribe. The Prime Minister was buried on the 8th of March, 1951. His case file was closed the same day. In June 1917, in the Serbian city of Salonika, the commander of Serbian military intelligence was shot by a firing squad composed of soldiers under his own command. He had been convicted of treason against the country he had spent his entire life building. His name was Dragutin Dmitrievich, a Serbian intelligence officer. His organizational name, the name under which every intelligence file in 3 capitals had recorded him for 15 years, was Apis. The man who organized the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and triggered the First World War was executed not by his enemies. He was executed by his own government, during wartime, at a point when losing even one effective intelligence officer could cost Serbia the entire conflict. The official reason was treason. The actual reasoning, if it existed in written form, was not preserved in any accessible archive. What is preserved is the fact of the execution, the timing of it, and the systematic refusal of the court to enter any evidence relating to Apis's foreign contacts into the trial record. The Ujedinjenje ili Smrt, Union or Death, was founded in Belgrade in 1911 by a group of Serbian army officers. Its public name was the Black Hand, taken from the skull and hand insignia on its membership seal. Initiation required a blood oath, administered in a windowless room by candlelight, before a cross and a dagger. This is documented in the Salonika trial records and confirmed by multiple surviving members' testimony. Its official function was pan-Serbian nationalism. Its operational function was control of Serbian military intelligence and the management of covert activities along the Austro-Hungarian border, including the networks that moved weapons, money, and trained operatives through mountain passes that no official crossing would accommodate. Gavrilo Princip, the man who shot Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, received his weapons training at camps the Salonika trial record identifies as Black Hand administered. The pistol used in the assassination was sourced through a supply chain the same record traces to Black Hand logistics. Apis knew this. Every intelligence service in Europe knew this. The relevant British intelligence files remain partially classified in the Public Record Office. The relevant Austro-Hungarian records were destroyed in the final days of the empire. After the war's outcome was secured, after the political map had been redrawn in ways that required certain inconvenient histories to remain buried, Apis was tried, convicted, and shot. The formal charges were collaboration with the enemy. His actual operational record showed the opposite. The Salonika trial transcripts were classified immediately upon the verdict. They were not publicly available until the 1980s. When researchers finally accessed them, they found a proceeding that systematically refused to enter evidence pointing toward the involvement of foreign powers in the Black Hand's operations. The trial was not designed to find the truth. It was designed to close the file. And here is where 10 organizations, 3,000 years, and 5 continents collapse into a single observation. The grain inspector in Rome, the forest judge in Westphalia, the mountain librarian in Alamut, the knife in Jerusalem's marketplace, the silk cord on a Ganges trade road, the republic in the mountains above Kyoto, the leopard tracks in Nigerian soil, the postal clerk in Constantinople, the theology student in Tehran, the intelligence officer in Salonika. None of them were what they appeared to be. All of them were erased the moment their usefulness ended. And in every single case, the erasure followed the same sequence. The individual could be arrested, tried, executed, publicly denounced. The method, the actual operational architecture, had to disappear quietly, reclassified, refiled, absorbed into something new enough that no one would connect it to what came before. That sequence appears 10 times in this list, across 3,000 years, 5 continents, and 6 different political systems. The pattern is either an extraordinary coincidence of institutional behavior, or it is the oldest lesson in the management of power. The most dangerous thing you can build is a tool that works, because a tool that works creates the question of who controls it, and the answer to that question is always more frightening than the tool itself. Most people read the summary and move on. You watched 10 cases and stayed with the discomfort of how consistent this gets. Which of these 10 had the most complete erasure and the most powerful reason for it? Pick one. Make the case. Best documented argument gets pinned. If this series generates enough serious engagement, the next 10 files are already organized. Subscribe, because there are cases in this research I didn't include. And the reason I didn't include them is that the documentation is still too thin, which, given everything you've just seen, might be the most interesting thing about them.